listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Could we be seeing the start of the mortgage wars? Australian banks are once again competing hard for your money. And after a year of not so great cost of living news, can we finally breathe a sigh of relief as the banks start to fight with each other?
This year we've seen a truce, a détente, I guess, in the mortgage wars. But recently, in the last month or two, there's just been a few price cuts and now there's questions. Are we seeing the mortgage wars re-emerge?
Whether you have a mortgage, want to buy your first home, or you just have a little bit of cash in your savings account, Australia's new maybe mortgage wars are likely to affect you. We'll tell you how in the second half of this episode. First, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spiru on Thursday, October 31st.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. Anthony Albanese is continuing to face intense scrutiny over his relationship with former Qantas boss Alan Joyce. This all kicked off over the weekend when it was revealed the PM had been handed 22 free flight upgrades between 2009 and 2022, including while he was Transport Minister. Now, after days of questions from both the opposition and the media, Albanese's been forced to clarify that he never asked for those free upgrades, Sash. A spokesperson for the Prime Minister releasing a statement last night saying, quote, "The Prime Minister did not ever call Alan Joyce seeking an upgrade, and all travel has been appropriately declared and is a matter of public record."
But this doesn't confirm whether the PM texted or emailed for upgrades, which is something that the opposition has seized on, but also Independent Senator David Pocock. He brought it up on ABC's 7:30 program last night. While he acknowledged, well, did he text, did he email, there's tricky language in this statement, Pocock thinks there is a bigger issue at play.
This is worth looking into, but let's not lose sight of the bigger picture here. You've got politicians willing to sling mud, but they're not actually willing to address the root causes of this, which is a lobbying system that is just so loose.
Peter Dutton has been piling on the pressure, calling on Albo to refer himself to the corruption watchdog, amid claims the PM's relationship with Joyce may have impacted government policy decisions. But Labor ministers are rallying around Albanese, calling it an unfair attack on his integrity.
Yeah, and I found the statement very interesting because I think a lot of the presses that Albo was doing and when he was asked by journos on this, it was very wishy-washy. It was, there's a process in place. I may have contacted certain Whereas now the statement's very clear. He's like, nope, never called Alan Joyce, which for me, I'm like, it's interesting that he's very specific. I like that Pocock has pointed out that, well, with this specificity, there's also, little loopholes that maybe the PM or then Transport Minister may have taken advantage of.
I think, though, this whole thing begs the question, what do we expect from our politicians, though? And I can see the coalition seizing on it. David Pocock, as we heard, thinks that it's worth looking into deeper because it is. If you're, being influenced by big businesses and that's affecting policy decisions, well, that's a huge question for the Australian people and it should be answered. However, the issue of the free upgrades and saying that it's corrupt behaviour, we learned yesterday 90% of politicians have access or have memberships to the Chairman's Lounge. Yeah. That's that exclusive Qantas club, which means they've been invited to it and that they are probably getting free upgrades as well. It's something that they all do. I don't think the average Aussie punter is that outraged at that, but we know that politics can often end up in the gutter and we've kind of found ourselves there again.
The United Nations Security Council has become the latest international body to warn Israel against banning the UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA. In a move branded by several world leaders as a violation of international law, Israel earlier this week officially declared UNRWA a terror group, giving them 90 days to cease their operations in Israel. UNRWA employs at least 1,000 people in Gaza and provides nearly the entire population with basic supplies via roads that go through Israel. Israeli authorities say other aid organisations will be able to fill the void. However, all 15 members of the Security Council maintain no other agency has the capacity to replace them.
Yeah, and that's a sentiment that's shared by Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong, who earlier this week said that this body performs life-saving work. This sentiment has been echoed by leaders in Canada, France, Germany, Japan, South Korea and the UK, to name just a few. We've also heard outrage from Secretary-General of the UN, Antonio Guterres. Now, this ban comes after Israel accused UNRWA workers of being involved in the October 7 attacks. This happened earlier this year, and it actually did spark a UN investigation into the claims. But the UN said it couldn't verify independently these accusations. We saw a number of, including Australia, a number of countries pull funding for UNRWA while that investigation was happening. It was reinstated, though, by a lot of countries, including Australia, once the UN had completed this investigation.
And finishing up today in our favourite place, the US, Sasha, where Kamala Harris has been quick to distance herself from comments made by Joe Biden.
I strongly disagree with any criticism of people based on who they vote for.
This was in response to that comedian who called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage at a Trump rally on Sunday. The US president saying this when he was asked about it.
The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters.
Yeah, so Biden was on a charity call when he made those comments, and it sparked immediate comparisons to Hillary Clinton's disastrous comments in 2016 when she called the Republicans' supporters a basket of deplorables. Now, this was widely seen as a huge moment against Hillary and for Trump, the fact that she was attacking his supporters, which is something that you just should never do when you're trying to win votes in an election. So Biden has moved to walk back the words. He tweeted, "Earlier today, I referred to the hateful rhetoric about Puerto Rico spewed by Trump's supporter at his Madison Square Garden rally as garbage, which is the only word I can think of to describe it. His demonization of Latinos is unconscionable. That's all I meant to say." So that's Biden's attempt to walk back what he said. Trump, of course, has seized on the gaffe with less than a week now until the US election.
Remember Hillary? She said deplorable. And then she said irredeemable, right? But she said deplorable. That didn't work out. Garbage, I think, is worse, right? But he doesn't know. You have to please forgive him. Please forgive him, for he not knoweth what he said.
Oh, look, the man might be wild, but he knows how to work a room, Sash. He really does.
You really like how Trump speaks, and I find it off-putting because I don't find it makes sense. It's very... I don't know, I think it appeals to the lowest common denominator, which might be why you like it.
Thank you so much.
I don't know.
Look, for clarity, I wish to clarify, I do not agree with his politics. I just really enjoy the entertainment value of having a former man who dominated entertainment in Hollywood and all these spaces for so long, now running for president. It is wild. It is insane. It's terrifying. But this is why I enjoy watching him.
Yeah, and there's been a poll as well that's asked how people think he might react if he loses next week. So this was a survey by George Mason University and the Washington Post. It found a majority of voters in swing states think that he won't accept defeat if he loses and that his supporters will turn to violence, which is, like we joke and we sit, I say it all the time, we sit here in Australia and go, haha, look at those silly Americans and their silly politics. But we saw what happened in 2020 and 2021, what happened when he lost. So I think people are genuinely afraid of what could play out next week and into the future. But either way, polls show it's on a knife edge. It could go either way. Neither of them have a clear lead either in swing states or nationally. So what am I doing a countdown on? We're on 6 days to go. Chris, thanks so much for joining us for the headlines today. Next up, it's Helen Smith's deep dive looking into mortgage wars and why they could help you.
Housing has been one of the top issues when it comes to the cost of living crisis, and it's been a year of pretty poor housing news. But it looks like the banks might be back to fighting each other over the best possible deal they can offer you. Big banks fighting for our money is nothing new. Mortgage wars have been fierce in this country. So is this the new era, or just a temporary reprieve? And who should you talk to and trust about it? Alec Renehan is the co-founder and co-host of Equity Mates Media, and he's here to help us understand what it means for us all, whether you might be a first home buyer or somebody already bearing the weight of a mortgage. Alec, welcome to the briefing. What are the mortgage wars and why are they back?
The banks essentially are competing on price for our business. And 2023, there was the mortgage wars were very hot. All the major banks were cutting the interest rate they charge on mortgages to try and get people to move. You know, if you're with Commonwealth Bank, ANZ wanted your business, and the way they tried to get your business was by offering you a better interest rate. Now, late 2023, early 2024, all the banks started talking publicly in the press that the mortgage wars were costing them money and they were all going to stop the mortgage wars. And this year we've seen a truce, a détente, I guess, in the mortgage wars. But recently, in the last month or two, there's just been a few price cuts, and now there's questions, are we seeing the mortgage wars re-emerge? I don't think we're even close to the mortgage wars being on again, but seeing price cuts is good for Aussie homeowners, so it's good to see.
What does all of this happening now mean for people who already have a mortgage?
Yeah, so it's great news for people with mortgages, and especially for people who have had mortgages as the Reserve Bank raised the cash rate from 0.1% to 4.35%. Because as the Reserve Bank raises the cash rate, then banks pass that on to mortgage holders in the form of higher interest rates on their mortgage. Now we're starting to see better inflation numbers. The most recent inflation number came out and it's back within the target band of 2 to 3%. We got inflation reading of 2.8%. We're not going to see the Reserve Bank cut rates straight away. They want to see how sustainable this inflation level is, but it does signal that we're getting closer. And so what the banks are doing is they're just getting ready for that, and they're starting to cut rates in anticipation of the Reserve Bank. And that's good for mortgage holders because it means they're paying less interest on their loans.
Now, what about people who don't have a mortgage and who are trying to get into the housing market?
Yeah, now this is the big question, isn't it? Because aspirational first home buyers, people that have been sitting on the sidelines and trying to save but feeling like their savings aren't keeping up with the crazy price of housing, hear the interest rates are going to be cut. And it is true that they will be able to borrow more. So like that is good in the sense that they'll be able to afford more. The problem for first home buyers is everyone else can borrow more as well. So it's all relative when you're talking about the price of housing because it's a competition to buy the house or apartment that you want to get. And so it is good news, you can borrow more. The bad news is everyone else can as well.
Plenty of people took out mortgages when the interest rates were lower during COVID and might be regretting it now. Should people be cautious about the apparently cheap fixed mortgage rates that we're starting to see?
I mean, you should always be cautious when you're talking about borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy anything. I think the important thing to note with the first signals of interest rate cuts we're seeing now is the banks are cutting rates and are offering a better rate than we're paying now. So, for example, Commonwealth Bank's rate is around 6.5% for variable rates, and you could go and fix your rate at about 5.75% with ANZ at the moment. And that's great. That's a real cash saving for people who are doing it tough. But what economists seem to think is that over 2 years, rates will get cut multiple times and the variable rate will probably be lower than that 5.75%. So that's where you want to be careful because what might look like a great deal now, 2 years down the track, you might have actually saved money if you just stuck with your variable rate and let the interest rate cuts come through. So I think it's really a question of like how much mortgage stress are you under, and if you need that immediate relief, take it because it's there. But if you are being able to service your mortgage and you're going okay, maybe hold on because there might be more interest rate cuts on the horizon. But the last thing I would say is it's not all or nothing. Homeowners can fix part of their loan. So if you want some relief, but you want to keep and fix some of it and then keep some variable, you can do that as well.
So if I do have a mortgage or I'm entering this space, who should I be talking to make sure I'm making the right choices? Or, if you're not sure and you're just new to it, is there someone out there who's the best voice of reason to listen to?
Yeah, there's a lot of voices in the property market, aren't there? It might be a bit harder to sometimes find the voice of reason. Look, if you have a financial advisor, it's always great to speak to them. The big problem in Australian finance at the moment is that financial advice is so expensive. 15 years ago, 20% of us had a financial advisor. Today, it's only 10% of us can get a financial advisor. So if you're in the majority that can't afford a financial advisor, the best person to speak to is a mortgage broker, and they will go out and check what you can get in terms of different mortgage deals, different interest rates, and they can compare it to your current loan. And normally that will be at no cost. So if you can't afford a financial advisor, speak to a mortgage broker. Even if you're just thinking about buying a property in the next 1 or 2 years, if you're a first home buyer and you're trying to figure it out and you want some free advice on what you need to do, how much you need to save, go and speak to a mortgage broker because they can be quite helpful.
So jumping back into what the banks are doing, what is their strategy? What's happening from the banks?
Their strategy is to make money. And the way that Australian banks, especially the big Australian banks, make money is mortgages. And so there's 2 ways really that they make money from mortgages. It's having the total number of mortgages that they have and then the amount of interest they charge on those mortgages. And so 2023 was a year where the banks were really focused on growing that total number of mortgages. They were willing to cut the amount they make, compete on price, and try and get customers. The last 12 months, they haven't been willing to compete on price as much, and they made good interest and extreme. They're very profitable, the Aussie banks, compared to even their peers around the world. The banks are just doing what they always do. They're just trying to make money from mortgages. And I think the important thing to know is that they're pretty smart, they're banks, and if they're offering a good fixed rate and they know that there are interest rate cuts coming, they're going to be pricing it at a point where they still think they'll, over the life of the fixed rate, 2 or 3 years, they'll probably make more from that. So to answer your question directly, they're just trying to make money as they always do.
Yeah, I guess that's why they're the big banks, hey? So if these banks keep fighting on prices and if we keep kind of seeing these mortgage wars like just ahead, does the government have any role to play into keeping things fair, or do they just kind of sit back and let things unfold?
I think the government has more of a role to play in the housing market more generally, and I think that's probably a bigger policy discussion than we have time for today. I think specifically around mortgage prices, the government doesn't really have a role to play. It's really dictated by the Reserve Bank's cash rate and then just the competitive forces in the market, and I don't think we would really want anything different. I think the bigger questions of housing affordability and how first home buyers can get into such a difficult market certainly warrant government attention. I know there's been talks of a recent policy suggestion was floated was for first home buyers to allow them to have 40-year mortgages, which would allow them to essentially borrow more relative to existing home buyers. So the government are looking at proposals like that. But the structural problems in the Australian housing market are a lot bigger than just the interest rates we pay on mortgages.
Are there any banks in particular that are competing harder for our loans than others?
It depends. The different banks are all sort of competing at different times. So for example, very recently, like in the last couple of weeks, ANZ cut their fixed rate mortgages twice and are now the cheapest, but only for a certain proportion of borrowers, only for people that meet certain criteria. So banks, they'll compete for certain borrowers at certain times. The one that is really coming pretty hard at the moment in terms of taking market share is Macquarie Bank. They've sort of taken a foothold in the market and are really taking it to the big 4 existing banks. But I think the thing is, there's over 30 lenders in Australia, well, actually even more than that, but there are so many choices, and that's where mortgage brokers can really do a lot of that work of seeing what the best price is for you. I would suggest not just going to one bank and getting their price, because it is a competitive market and there's a lot of choice, and you should really explore your options.
So should we expect the current situation to continue long term, or are these things always cycling through? It'll happen, it'll stop, it'll come back around again?
Yeah, it's always a cycle. It's always how competitive is the market? If one bank does something, then the other banks feel like they need to respond. I think the current situation we're in now with the Reserve Bank's interest rate, we're sort of we've plateaued for a year, and there's expectations that the cash rate will sort of go from 4.35% where it is now to the sort of mid 3% in the next 12 months. So we should expect sort of 2 or 3 interest rate cuts, and we'll see banks reduce their mortgages in line with that. But you wouldn't expect them to do a heap more than that. So I don't think we're going to have a return to the mortgage wars of 2023. It might be more a mortgage skirmish in 2025.
Alec, thanks for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you.
That was Alec Renehan, co-founder and co-host of Equity Mates Media, giving us a little bit of insight into these mortgage wars, and it looks like they're only going to get a little bit more fierce. But that's it for this episode of The Briefing. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this ep with someone else you think might enjoy it as well. And hey, while you're there, if you could follow or subscribe to wherever you're listening to this podcast from, it really does help us keep creating content that you love. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and YouTube, just search for Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed with another ep this afternoon from 3. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.
Listener.